Hi everyone, and welcome to our first lecture for Lit 266 Science Fiction. We have a very short term for the winter, so I decided to theme the class, as you've probably seen on Blackboard. We're going to be looking at dystopian fiction, and hopefully you've already watched the video and looked at the notes about dystopia and what that means, and the features of that type of literature. So I decided to start the course out with a very short work. I know the first week is more of a partial week. And I think that this book, Anthem by Ayn Rand, which she named Anthem because she said it was a hymn to man's ego, as you can see right there. And this is our author over here. She wrote this book based in large part because of her experiences in communist Russia. So the first lecture for this book, because we're still establishing some of the tropes and archetypes and features of dystopian fiction, I decided to break this book, even though it's the shortest book we're reading, I decided to break it up into two sets of lectures. So this first lecture today is going to focus on the historical background, the author's life, and some of the things that influenced her work. And then the second part of the lecture will focus more on the book and the themes, motifs, characterization, things of that nature. So let's get started. So, taking a look at the historical background. In 1905, Ayn Rand was born in Russia, the same year that the Russo-Japanese War ended. The Russians and the Japanese were bitterly embattled over certain portions of land, and the Russians lost the war. At that point, there was a revolution and an attempt to overthrow the Tsar. Now, the Tsar, sometimes it's spelled with a C, and I think I have that a little bit later, but essentially the Tsar would be like the king, the head ruler. So a few years after the defeat, that 1905 revolution did not completely overthrow the government, which it was intending to do. But a few years later, Tsar Nicholas dragged 11 million peasants into World War I. And we're going to look at in a minute sort of how the Russian system was set up at that time. But the peasants were drafted into the war, while people who had a little bit more money were not. And if you ever have the chance to read a book like Anna Karenina or War and Peace, there's a large number of people who are in the Russian nobility. So those people were not, did not have compulsory service in the war, while the poor people did. There's injuries, there's loss of life. By 1917, Russia is in ruins, again defeated, and the people, in part because of that and in part because of other socioeconomic factors, the people decide to revolt again. So by this point, our author was 12, and the Russian Imperial Empire, as it was known at that point, collapsed. Nicholas II and his entire family were murdered by members of the Bolshevik secret police. Now, the revolution actually happened with not just the Bolsheviks, but a variety of different groups. And so and there we see them. I'm going to zoom in on this picture for you, if I can. Can I? There we go. So this is a protest in Russia, and you can see the people in their heavy coats and all that. So what occurred is that the country is plunged into civil war. So Lenin, the leader who had been exiled by the Tsar, comes back into the country to lead the Bolsheviks in this revolution, and he has a slogan of peace, land, bread. But because of all the different factions that were involved in the overthrow. And this is pretty typical as well when we see countries that are run by a king or a dictator. When there's some type of revolution, very often there's civil war or chaos for a long period of time because the king or the czar in this case, or the dictator in another case, held such a tight rule over the different factions that he was basically the common enemy, right? So, for example, I think you can see this in places like Iraq where when Saddam Hussein is taken out, everything kind of goes into chaos because there is it goes from having a very strict structure to having no structure. So these are some of the things that the author Ayn Rand lived through. She and her family go through all of these difficulties during the Civil War. And in somewhere between 1918 and 1921, again, it's sort of hard to tell because they were in civil war and then because of some of the things that happened to Russia after. Essentially, they had peace as part of their slogan, and then they enact a policy of war communism, which means that they're able to have war if it's to perpetuate communism. In terms of land, they wanted all of the land to be equally distributed, and in terms of bread, they wanted to not go through the famines and the starvation that they had gone through in the Russo-Japanese War and then also in World War I, right? The problem is that when communism becomes fully recognized in Russia, the state takes control of the entire economy, and millions of peasants are starved to death because the army is confiscating grain for its own needs and those of the people who are living in the cities. Again, people who had a little bit more money or people who had supported the revolution. So the idea of peace, land, bread, right from the outset doesn't work. This is a view of how it's the pyramid of the capitalist system, which is what was perpetuated by Marx. We're going to hear about him more a little bit later with a different book. But Marx basically was saying that capitalism, this is sort of the profits. The rulers, here we have like the king or a czar or the nobility, in Russia's case. Capitalism is the profits. We rule you. We fool you. This is the religious caste, which in Russia would have also been quite wealthy. We shoot at you would have been the military, keeping everything in order. Again, getting paid, getting bread, getting land, all of that. We eat for you. So this is one of the... My writing here is not great. Sorry. It's hard to write with a mouse. But the bourgeois are the sometimes also the sort of the middle class or the upper class. And basically, we feed all, we work for all, and here you have the peasants at the bottom. And you can see one of them has died or fainted from the struggle. They're trying to keep this whole thing alive. And then we have people over here who are waving the flag to help rebel. And also the children down here too, right? So this is the type of system that they were kind of trying to rebel against in Russia. You had this nobility, these religious leaders, the military, and then sort of a middle class, some nobility in here as well, but the bourgeois is what they would call them, and they were all being held up by the peasant class, so people who were working in factories and people who were working in farms, trying to support the entire system, and as you can see, really feeling oppressed by it. The problem is that the communist system that was actually put into place ended up being another pyramid. So here I have Stalin, who I'll talk about in a moment, but essentially you have the ruler or the dictator up at the top, the Communist Party, the secret police, which would also include military as well, and then the masses, right? So cutting out the religious leaders, but still having only, and I will say not everyone in the Communist Party, right? Because everyone had to be part of the Communist Party. It's a one-party system. But the Communist Party, almost the rulers here becoming almost like a new nobility, a new noble class. I actually had the opportunity once of talking to, in an interview, talking to one of the former leaders of the Communist Party in high school, and I asked basically about this system. I said, do you feel like the rulers of the Communist Party became almost like the nobility that they were trying to fight against? And he refused to answer my question and walked off the stage, which was a great moment because I felt sort of like, the non-answering is the answer in and of itself. But this pyramid is exceedingly important because we're going to look at dystopias in fiction that reflect some of this reality, and the different books that we look at are going to examine this hierarchy or structure in different ways. So in Anthem, we'll talk about in the next lecture, we'll talk a little bit more about how this social hierarchy plays out within Rand's novel. So a little bit more historical background. I just showed you a picture of Stalin. Lenin, though, was running the country at first. So the USSR forms in 1922 officially. That's when the Civil War finally ended. The government and the economy become centralized, and that's a huge theme in Ayn Rand's book. The party is one party state governed by the Communist Party, as I mentioned, so everyone belongs to the Communist Party, although within the Communist Party, again, there's a severe hierarchy, right? You have a dictator up here, you have the new nobility or the rulers here, and then kind of the masses all the way down at the bottom, setting up the same type of system. Stalin comes to power in 1924, and he has a command economy. Now, what he basically wanted to do was rapidly industrialize to keep up with the other nations after World War I. And I should have mentioned this too. The reasons that people rebelled after World War I. World War I, unlike World War II, where there was a dictator trying to take over things and horrible atrocities were committed. Because of those atrocities, I think World War II we talk about more. Also because there are still some people who fought in World War II or who are still alive, whereas World War I, most of them have passed. So most of the people alive during that period of time have passed. But the problem with World War I is that it was a war based on little skirmishes in Europe that then many people got dragged into because of alliances. And a lot of people became embittered and disillusioned after that war. The other thing about World War I is that it was the first war to use modern warfare, meaning that you have vehicles, you have planes, you have poisonous gases. Whereas before, the wars were, fought with sort of, if you think about, or if you've ever seen Civil War reenactments, there's a line of one group on one side, there's a line of the other group on the other side, there's a trench in between, and they fight in relatively close space, right? So there's not, and they had cannonballs, but certainly not bombs and poisonous gas and chemical warfare the way World War I did. So after World War I, because of the technology used in the war and other factors, many countries began to industrialize even more. Russia was a little bit behind, so they wanted to rapidly industrialize and push more people into factories and that kind of thing. There's also this idea of collectivization. Collectivization is the forced consolidation of households into collective farms. I'm not going to try to pronounce that word. Kolkhozes, I think it's said. So the idea of collectivization is prominent in Anthem. The idea that everything belongs to everyone else, which is actually another thing that's repeated in our second book, Brave New World. Everyone belongs to everyone else. Collectivization and trying to make everyone equal. So this is a picture of communist propaganda at the time. You can kind of see up here the factories, right, and the farms and the threshing machines, and both men and women helping out using industrialized machinery. So threshers to harvest the grain, taking it together out of the factory, out of the farm and into town, everyone working together, right? You can see here crossed out one man with one ox working on his own. That's not going to happen anymore. One man going into town or going to the factory, that's not going to happen anymore. Now we all work together. And, philosophically working together sounds like a great idea. It's just that usually in practice, it just doesn't work because of some of the things that happen in Russia, as we'll talk about. And when we get to our book Match, we'll talk a little bit more about smaller utopian societies or communes and how many times sexuality is sort of what drives that apart. In this book, sexuality plays a little bit of a part in the difficulties with the society, and we'll get into that again in our second lecture. So during this period of totalitarian rule under Stalin, there's a lot of political paranoia, which we see as a theme in our book. In the 1930s, there's this great purge to remove Stalin's opponents. And Ayn Rand's book is written in the later 1930s. It's not the earliest book that we're looking at. Brave New World was written a few years before, but both Ayn Rand's book and Handmaid's Tale, which is our third book we're looking at, have this idea in there: political paranoia, arbitrary arrests, persecution. There's mentions of torture and that kind of thing. In 1933, there is a major famine in Soviet Ukraine in particular, and it strikes the grain-growing regions. The combined death toll from these incidents is somewhere between 6 and 13 million. Because the Soviet Union by this point was a closed society, we really don't have a clear death count. That is almost impossible to determine now, because it's been so long. But back then, because of Stalin's rule, because there's no freedom of the press and no freedom of speech, you really don't, and the secret police are, tormenting people, and there's paranoia everywhere. People are being watched. We can't really know how many people died, but between the collectivization, which did not work, people being driven out from their homes, because of the arrests, the persecutions, and the famines, it's estimated that it's in the millions. So, about the author, I include this picture just because I think her hat's kind of funny. Ayn Rand, as I said, she was born the year of the first revolution in 1905. She was 12 in 1917 when the Bolsheviks take over. And when they took over, her father's business was confiscated. She is part of the bourgeois class, so particularly facing persecution. So during the Civil War, the family goes to the Crimean Peninsula, which was under control of the White Army, so sort of seeking protection there. When that's also lost at the end of the Civil War, she finished high school that year, and then they returned to Petrograd. Because of the famines, they nearly starved to death. And the city here, Petrograd, formerly known as St. Petersburg, all of the cities were renamed by the Communist Party, so kind of relabeling things and losing identity, which is another thing that we'll talk about in her book. How things are named is important. After the Russian Revolution, for a short period of time, universities are open to women. So Ayn Rand is one of the first group of women to enroll at Petrograd State University, again renamed. However, as power is consolidated more and more within the Communist Party, the universities purge the bourgeois or the middle class students, and she's forced to leave. I thought I spelled that wrong in the other slide. You can just ignore that. So the bourgeois, as I mentioned, are particularly under attack here. And I think it's partially because the rulers had power and they were murdered and gotten rid of. And but the bourgeois are the people that were eating and drinking and dancing, and they had nice houses and comfortable lives, and that's something that the peasants particularly envied. I don't think that you have peasants who necessarily, some of them sure wanted to be in the ruling class, but they didn't necessarily want to be in the military or to be the religious leaders that everyone looked up to, right? What they really wanted was just the comforts that were not afforded to them. Land and housing and food. So because she was forced to leave the university, Ayn Rand came to the United States. Now, I was not able to find out what happened to the rest of her family. I know that she came to the U.S. To be with family members who were already here. And as I said before, there's no freedom of the press or freedom of speech in Russia at that time. So when she comes to the United States, she starts watching movies, which were silent still in 1925. But she's inspired by these movies. She wanted to be a writer, and she leaves her relative's house to go to Hollywood to become a screenwriter. The screenwriting, she sort of had some moderate success, but then she published her first novel, We the Living, in 1936, much more based on her own experiences in Russia than Anthem. Anthem is, I feel like We the Living is sort of lightly fictionalized. There's some drama there, but a lot of it is based on her own experiences. But Anthem, she publishes in 1938. She published it in England. She could not get a publisher in the United States. Now, people who follow her philosophy, which we'll talk about in a moment, her philosophy of objectivism, people who really follow her philosophy who are, she has some very almost rabid fans in a sense. And they kind of claim that America was a more socialist country than England at the time, and that's why she couldn't find a publisher in America. I think that she couldn't find a publisher in America because Anthem is 46 pages long. It's not even a novella. It's called a novelette. And I think that it's difficult to sell things like that. being a publisher myself, I can tell you I can't sell a book that's going to be 50 pages long unless it's for very young children. So in any case, eventually it was published in the United States. Her most famous works, though, are The Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged, which are published in 1947 and 1953, respectively. And I think those two books show a little bit more of her philosophical ideals. Anthem is published really before she develops the philosophies that she later on only wrote, really almost exclusively wrote nonfiction and philosophical works. And she died in 1982. And because she died in 1982, we have video recordings of her. So make sure that you watch after this lecture, maybe before the second one. Watch the interviews of Ayn Rand, because I think, I'm going to be describing her philosophy here, but I think seeing her talk about it, and in particular her interview with Donahue, where he is very skeptical and kind of tries to push back against some of her ideas a little bit. So Ayn Rand's philosophy: she was an atheist and advocated reason as the only means of acquiring knowledge. So facts over emotion and abolition of religion, faith, and spirituality. She supported egoism. Sometimes we might call this selfishness, and rejects altruism, generosity. She condemned the initiation of force as immoral as well. So again, you can kind of see a lot of her ideals coming out of her experiences living in communist Russia. In communist Russia, there is collectivism, and it's called altruism or generosity, but it becomes problematic because everyone's things are taken away and sort of redistributed, right? So you are forced to sacrifice yourself for the state. And because of that, Ayn Rand is basically saying egoism is a better way to go. Prior to communist rule, the USSR was an atheist country, nominally, in name at least. It was an atheist country regardless of who practiced faith there. And so it's sort of interesting to me, though, that she didn't turn against. But she opposed communism and collectivism, which I've already talked about, and supported laissez-faire capitalism in an extreme way. Individuals having rights, including property rights, and a hands-off approach to government. So minimal state intervention in the lives of citizens. Today we might call this libertarianism. I would say that Ayn Rand kind of goes even beyond libertarianism. So here is a pyramid of her philosophy, and I'll talk about some of the benefits or some of the ways I feel like she was right, and some of the ways I feel like she kind of goes off the rails. So it begins at the bottom with reality. Man's relationship to the universe is reality. So no emotion, really. There's no spiritual meaning behind things. There's no superstition. What you see is what you get. As it says, existence exists. So her essential reasoning is that you are here on this earth, and when you die, and that's it. Period. Epistemology, man's relationship with his mind, is reason. Again, the idea of reason over emotion. Ethics, self-interest. So you notice too that she's defining ethics not as our relationships with each other, but just as man's relationship with himself. So looking out for the self first above other people. Politics, capitalism, which is interesting to me because capitalism is not a political system. Capitalism is an economic system. And you can have an economic system based on capitalism and a political system based on something else. So you could have democracy or totalitarian rule and still have a capitalist society. They're not mutually exclusive of each other. So I kind of feel like that's one way in which she's not exactly correct here. But politically, that's what she believed, that the politics should be based on capitalism. Again, just from purely logistical standpoint, it's not correct. Capitalism is an economic system. Romantic realism is man's relationship with beauty. So there are two traditions of literature and art that took place around this time. The first is Romanticism and the second is realism, really more taking place in the 1800s than the 1900s, which is sort of interesting to me. By the time she was born and after World War I, we get into modernism, and she kind of rejects modernism and says that we should only look at works that are realistic and are only romantic, not love romantic, but aesthetically romantic. They're romantic in the sense that they bring us to a better understanding of reality. So I think the way in which her system is interesting, philosophically speaking, is that she only really looks at one or two philosophers with whom she agrees. And she talks about this in one of the interviews I posted for you. So she rejects a lot of other philosophical ways of thinking. I think that it's very clear that this comes out of her experiences in Russia and with communism and the horrors that she had to face there. I mean, having your parents' livelihood be ripped away from them, having to flee from your home so that you are not killed or imprisoned or tortured, living in exile for several years, trying to return and then going through a famine and almost starving. These are all the things that she faced. So in that, it makes sense that she would reject some of those things and say, no, we need to work for our own self-interest. We need to establish a capitalist system that's based on the free market and what people decide to buy, rather than the communist system and, and the collectivization of everything. The difficulties with her philosophy is that really they're only accepted by a small group of people. First of all, because, as I said, capitalism isn't a political system, it's an economic system. But also because there are some contradictions. So metaphysically, to go back here for a moment, Ayn Rand would say that everything is based on reality, and what happens to you is already predetermined by a number of things. So who your parents are, what situation you're born into, whether you are born wealthy or born into a more struggling family, what your genetics are, all of those kind of things. So she was a follower of Darwin, and at the same time, she also says that people have free will. And it's really difficult to have both of those things go on at the same time. Historically, her ethical and economic theories don't really work. When people work purely out of self-interest, they trample on the rights of others. So capitalism then becomes as oppressive as communism when you have large corporations working only in their self-interest. Now, what she says in the interview that I have provided for you is that it shouldn't really happen that way. Because if people are being trampled on, then they should stick up for themselves and start their own businesses, right? Get out from under the thumb of those larger corporations. The difficulty is that when you have a system set up like capitalism, let's take, for example, Walmart. You cannot have the average Walmart worker just say, forget this, I'm going to set up my own business and it'll rival Walmart. right? Because you have someone who has possibly children at home, a second job, they need this job to try to pay the bills, they're making minimum wage, and then at the same time, they're not getting the proper breaks that they're supposed to get, or their rights are being taken away in some way. So let's say they take a sick day and they're fired from their job, right? Those are the kind of things that happen when you have completely unbridled capitalism without unions or without a little bit of government oversight to prevent monopolies and things of that nature. Now, I will say this too, if you're not in my class and you're listening to this, it's okay if you follow her theories, and even if you are in my class, it's fine. I'm not telling you to think what I think. I just kind of want to point out both sides of her philosophy. I think that on the other side of her philosophy, she is right in saying that the equality, especially equality the way it's defined, I'm going to go back here for a second again. Equality the way it's defined by, especially by the Communist Party, just cannot, it doesn't exist. Equality in that sense does not exist. And she would say that if you, let me give you my own example. If I go and try to play basketball in the NBA, you're going to know right away that I do not belong there. I am clumsy, I am not fast, and I am you don't know because you're taking this online, but I'm not exactly the most fit person in the world, right? So if I try to go, you're going to know that I don't fit in there. So saying that I am equal in talent to a basketball player in the NBA is ridiculous. Similarly, other people are skilled with intelligence. Having an NBA player try to teach this class probably wouldn't work. There might be one or two of them that maybe could do it. I don't know much about basketball. But having people have natural gifts in the areas of science and medicine, for example. My brother is naturally gifted in mathematics, and he is in a medical program right now in college. That would not have worked for me. Saying that he and I are equal in that sense, in the sense of intelligence or skills or talent, is false. And that part of Ayn Rand's theory, I think, is very clear. And when we get into looking at her book a little bit more, that theory comes through very, very clearly. The difficulty is that not having any sense of altruism, not having any sense of generosity, that's actually what leads to totalitarian states, to dictatorships. In our country, it leads to sociopaths, people that cannot really feel and cannot see beyond their self-interests. Not historically, but psychologically, study after study after study shows that for people, the bonds of family, the bonds of community, and giving back and being generous and being altruistic are directly tied to things like health, happiness, and longevity. However, I will say there are many CEOs that disagree with what I'm saying right now, and many people who have been quite successful who follow Ayn Rand's work and believe that unbridled capitalism, free from government constraints, is really the best way to go. And being not selfish exactly, but yes, having self-interest and focusing on self-interest. So the real fact of the matter is that this particular book contains a few shades of her philosophy. She goes in to develop these theories of objectivism. I didn't mean to cross that out. Sorry. Later in life, and she expounds on them in her nonfiction works. But I kind of like to show what her theories are because I feel like in Anthem, she's beginning to develop them. So as I said, we see shades of it. We see little hints of it here and there that her later work kind of developed more. So really the important question for us is, in Rand's book, how does Anthem demonstrate her philosophy, but really her reaction against the experiences from the USSR? And what is she trying to say about the dangers of setting up this type of society where at first people think it might be a utopia and perfect and wonderful, where everyone is equal and everyone is the same and everyone, everything belongs to everyone and no one is ever alone? And what are really the dangers of that type of society? So we're going to take a look at that in our next lecture, and I look forward to talking more about it. I'll see you in a bit.